Hello and welcome everyone. I hope you had good sessions last week and yeah, a good weekend as well, of course. So today here we are going to talk about iShare, which of course is part of Hypertrust building blocks, and how iShare trust framework enables you to share data with other organizations in a trusted manner and more details about iShare, what it is, and what benefit it brings to you. So let's begin with a short introduction from my side. I'm Rajiv Rajani. I'm the CTO of iShare Foundation, um, uh, and have been quite involved in developing the iShare Trust Framework since quite some time now. So I know in and out of iShare Trust Framework and how to implement it. So feel free to shoot out any questions that you may have in terms of iShare, and I can definitely help you with that. Let's begin with the training. So yeah. So what do these things, these images on the screen remind you of subconsciously? You see a child being helped by his father, people doing some gymnastics or trust exercise. Oh, there did I say the word trust? Yes. So that is the word that uh, you can remind. These images remind you of subconsciously, right? So it is all about trust, essentially, and you need trust every day in our day-to-day life, even for basic things like traveling. Because you see all the infrastructure that we use today, we trust on them that they were built to last and can support all the transports that we do, and transports run on time so that we can reach our destinations on time, right? With trust, of course, you can build a lot of things and do a lot of impossible things that you individually cannot do, right? But is that the same situation with our data online with in the internet? Can we say with 100% confidence that all the data that we put on internet can we trust with the safeguards that we are having today in those terms, or not even internet, but even with using network to share with other participants or other organizations? Can we completely rely on digital trust? Today's mechanisms that we have in order to secure that data. To some extent, yes, but can we trust with our business critical data? So in today's world as well, what we do usually is when we are assigning our trust to somebody, as in some organization to host our data, for example, we enter into bilateral paper-based contract with that organization in terms of defining how they will secure our data, where they will store our data within the boundaries of Europe, for example, and who has access to that data. Can somebody from their organization have access, or would other clients have access to the data that they are storing on the same servers and things like that? So you enter into a lot of contracts in order to safeguard the data that you put online or to other host providers, basically. In return, of course, you get services, but that's a trade-off that you always make, and you do so by entering into bilateral contracts. But same applies when you are actually dealing with your partners and upstream and downstream vendors, for example, that you need to share some of the valuable information with them in order to fulfill your business needs. But what do they do with that data? You also protect that using bilateral contracts. So, two organizations, for example, in logistics, they are taking care of transport, so they need to share that information. but then they also need some agreement in order to make sure that they do not uh, impart on their customers, basically, because it's also competitive space for them. So what they do is they protect this via bilateral contracts, and in those contracts it's mentioned that the data that is shared because of the nature of the business may not be used to take away clients, for example, from that business, right? What if we said that instead of doing this bilaterally every time you want to share data with other organizations, you can do so digitally and in a very much more efficient manner, and with all the legal protections that bilateral contracts provide, right? And that legal trust, or that trust anchor, forms the basis for providing the digital version of authorizations to each other, and they can be verifiable, controllable, traceable, and it gives you the dynamicity that paper-based contracts cannot give you, right? So we introduce you to iShare Trust Framework, which enables all of this and more, of course. So what is iShare is essentially a trust framework which is agnostic to any data that is shared using this framework. So we don't the framework is designed such that you can share any kind of data with other organizations, right? And in any format. It's a federated model. So all the roles that are defined in iShare are completely distributed and federated. So these are defined as roles. So multiple organizations can provide you with the same services or same role offerings, and you are able to choose your own provider for for that role. It's distributed, so you don't need to dump all your data in a central platform, or you don't need to copy your data from various sources to another sources in order to share them, but instead it enables distributed data sharing, as in peer-to-peer or data at the source, for example. iShare is a not-for-profit foundation, so there is no profit motive for running the foundation, and this foundation maintains the trust framework for the participants. It's universal, so it has been generically designed to be applicable across the world, and also, of course, across different sectors. So iShare can be used in any sector in any region, right? And with that, we bring the possibility of data sovereignty to the data owners, as in they remain in control of the data even after the data has been shared, and trust in sharing of the data, which enables sharing, of course, and data spaces, right? Some background information about iShare. It's the first version was released in 2018 already, and organizations were already starting to use it in 2018. More than 1.5 million businesses data is already being exchanged using this framework. It is trusted by some governments. It's growing exponentially, um, and a lot of participants are getting added as we are speaking. It is compliant with GAIX and IDSA. Also, we are in collaboration with GAIX and IDSA, where the idea is that all iShare participants are also called GAIX compliant participants, and vice versa. And GAIX uses iShare as a trust framework that they wish to develop. They already found iShare as the relevant trust framework for it. Some more background. It was co-created, so iShare is not something that was created by one organization or a team. Basically, it was, of course, facilitated by a team, but preparations began in 2016 already, and we brought a consortium together in terms of the target parties. So iShare was born as a need in logistics sector where trusted data sharing was needed. So we brought a lot of logistics parties together and learned from them what works for them and what does not. And we created this trust framework, and it has been live in since 2018, used by other parties, not only in logistics but also in other sectors like energy, construction, agriculture, and others. And foundation, it was initiated as a project by some organization, but later on a foundation was set up to continue as a neutral entity which will continue to um, uh, evolve this framework and keep it relevant and maintain the trust. And this foundation is not for profit basically. iShare was built with guiding principles, and these are the guiding principles which are fulfilled by this framework. So it's a generic building block to enable data exchange. So as I said, it's universal already in previous slides. This was one of the guiding principles that when we designed the framework, we had to make sure that it is generic and it can be applicable in different locations or in different sectors as well. Limit the scope to the necessary minimum, and that is what we thought with trust framework. It's essential that you are able to identify and trust each other very well, and for that we have limited the scope to identification, authentication, and authorization. And that allows us to be data agnostic. So once you have done this, whatever data exchange follows after that is basically completely up to you, and in whichever way you wish to share data with each other, right? Leverage existing building blocks. So as you will see more today and also in the deep dive session that happens on Wednesday, we use existing building blocks that are very familiar, like standards like OAuth 2.0 and PKI infrastructure and those EIDAS building blocks. And we have built this framework using those as much as possible. However, they have their own shortcomings, and we try to gap them, fill those gaps by bringing them under this framework. As I said, agnostic towards nature and content of data, so you can share any kind of data with anyone and in any format. Benefits outweigh investment for all types of participants. This is an important guiding principle that we have maintained, and we will maintain forever. Is that no matter how large or small the organization is in the iShare network, the framework will not accept any changes which only favor one or one-sided organizations basically. So whenever a change is needed in the framework, all those changes are discussed with all participants, and all participants then provide with their advice in terms of what they feel about it. And when it is seen as it is only benefiting only a portion of participants, then it usually is not. It is not made in as a change in the framework. Those kind of things, right? It's international, so framework is usable across the world, and it enables federation. Our idea has been not to keep any lock-ins for any kind of participants with anyone. So you are free with your own choice in terms of where you store your identities and where you store your authorizations, which service providers you use, and things like that. So it enables that federation. So iShare is foundation for the following things, basically business aspects. The framework covers some basis for business data exchange and in maintaining the business data sovereignty, so that businesses can trustfully share the data without need of entering bilateral contracts every now and then. The The way iShare enables it is using multilateral construct in legal terms. So that's the legal aspect of the iShare framework, wherein organizations who agree to certain terms of use and they exceed that, they will agree to the agreements that are listed down, and the way of exchanging and identifying each other, basically. And that is the base agreement that every participant of iShare signs, and that is a legal contract, basically. And the way this works is that you sign this agreement with foundation, and other participant also signs this agreement with the foundation. And because there is a uh, foundation acting as a middle party with whom you have signed the agreements, you can share all the data with other organization using the same agreement as your cover, basically. So you don't need to sign bilateral contract with another organization. You can authorize the other organization using the digital means that are described in iShare specifications. This concept is called multilateral legal agreement contract, and that is a very common construct that is very well known across the world. So iShare trust framework is based on that. It covers all the necessary operational aspects. Of course, your business is important, and we understand that. And some of the SLA requirements and the basic protections that are needed in terms of handling with your data and processes, they are all covered in the operational aspects that are already defined in the framework. So all the participants playing certain roles, they need to comply with those aspects in order to provide services to the participants, and so that participants can rely on their services, essentially. Of course, here we are talking about digital data sharing, and then it cannot be without technical and functional specifications. So the technical design of iShare framework and the specifications are made with design including these elements. So the legal aspects behind it and the way you identify and authorize each other essentially covers those elements in the spec. Business and organization aspect a bit more in detail. So on the right, you see there are the three roles that are demonstrated, that is service consumer, service provider, and title party. A service consumer is the one who consumes a service that a service provider provides. And an entitled party is a party who actually has the right to the data. Essentially, if I say in layman terms, this could be simply said as data consumer, data provider, and data owner, respectively. So that data owner gives the authorization to data consumer that it can get the access to their data at the data provider that data owner uses to host the data. And these agreements are done by authorization registry, right? So for data owners, it's as simple as that. They just need to make sure that in an authorization registry there is rights given digitally to the data consumer, so that it can go to data provider to get the data. And that aspect is so for business owners or data owners, this is very simple aspect. Legal aspects, as I already covered, it is all about multilateral agreement that all participants sign. So you just need to sign with to become an iShare member once, and immediately you are actually known to all iShare based data spaces, and every participant from every other data space can identify you and authorize to you, or you can do the same with others. Then the only element that you need to figure out is what data to share and how you want to share that data. And for that, we have various tools, of course, which will be covered in the remaining part of the trainings, right? So the technical specifications, as I said, is also designed considering legal aspects. So all the things that are specified in technical specifications are done so for with the purpose, in the sense that it covers you legally when there is certain potential dispute arising because of sharing of data. Then you know how to um, find the right information within your digital systems, basically, to cover that. One more aspect that we have created or enabled in the using iSHARE Trust Framework is licenses are the cornerstone, basically data licenses. So how does data owner remain in control of the data even after it has been shared? So it uses data licenses when it is actually authorizing data consumers. And these data licenses are, in technical terms, called usage policies, basically. But it provides explicit instructions or conditions under which the data can be shared and used, basically. So, example of such an data license is, I give you rights to this data for one to be used for one time only for transporting my cargo from point A to point B, for example. That's one example of data license. Another very broad example could be, I don't care what you do with this data. So you can do whatever you wish with this data, for example. That's a very open data license then, right? And when you share the data with other participant using this license, and because of the multilateral contract or the agreement that you have signed, or the reason you are participating in iShare Trust Framework, this gives you the legal ground in terms of exercising your rights on that data license, and this is valid in court of law as well. Operational aspects mainly applies to the certified roles as seen on the right, the identity providers, iShare satellite, and authorization registries. More about these roles coming up in a bit. Um, but essentially, these are the roles on which you rely on in order in your data space in order to perform your regular activities as businesses. So, you as data owner or data consumer or even data provider, you trust in these providers that they will give you with the right information and they will provide you with timely services, for example, um, uh, so that you can trust the information that you receive from them and continue with the process. So those elements are basically covered within the framework. So any participant joining under any of these roles, they have to fulfill these requirements. The technical and functional specifications are very broad covering in that sense. And as I said, they already are with legal and privacy by design. But what it also is that these technical specifications enable are applicable in different scenarios, and it supports different scenarios. So the first one on the right, the image, it shows that two machines can talk with each other using iShare, or it's a machine-to-machine flow which enables data sharing. Um, when both parties implement iShare, for example. The second one is about human to machine interaction. The third one is about a party using third party services to enable iShare based exchange of data. And the fourth one is also about the whole organization implementing iShare for all of its services. So it enables data sharing in data by keeping data at the source, right? So different ways you can build integrations. You can reuse your existing integrations in place. Sorry. But also develop new integrations with use of iShare and share that with iShare using iShare mechanisms. So let's introduce with the role model, which we already saw these roles, but let me explain the roles one by one. So as I said, service consumer is basically the one who consumes the service that data provider or service provider provides. Generally, you can classify them as consumers, but that may or may not always be the case. So that's why we call them service consumers, because this is always fixed, that there is always a service provider and there is always a service consumer. Data flow can happen in either of the directions, right? So in iShare role model, we call them service consumer, whichever organization or party is consuming a service. Similarly, you have service provider. So there is always a service provider who provides a service. It may send data or it may receive data. It doesn't matter, as long as you think from service perspective, it is actually providing a service, right? And there is an entitled party. So broadly said, data owner, but data owner is a very complicated term because how will you determine a data owner when multiple parties have created that data set? So there are various reasons why data owner determining a proper data owner is always complicated. So instead, we call it as entitled party, and that means that what it essentially means is that it's a party who has an entitlement to that data set at that moment, right? These are roles which are interested in exchange of data, right? And you have to look at from use case perspective that a part of this use case is one step at a time, right? So these roles can be reversed in the next step, for example, or can be played by different organizations. Essentially, this will be a bit more clear in next session, where we go through with examples as well, right? And we have iShare satellite. So iShare satellite is essentially a trust anchor in between. It's a federated role but essentially iShare satellite is just a directory of all participants who have signed iShare trust framework agreement, basically, right? So it's a directory for all participants to find each other. That is essentially what iShare satellite is. It is not a CA, for example, certifying authority who issues identities or anything. It's nothing like that, right? It just is a registry of all the participants who are there. iShare satellite is based on distributed ledger technology. So no matter which satellite you use to onboard with the iShare framework, you are immediately known to all other data spaces which are using iShare as the framework, right? And that gives you base level of interoperability with every data space, irrespective of which sector, which region they are in. That it gives you the possibility to identify and authorize each other from each data spaces, basically. Then we have defined the role of identity providers. So identity providers are basically dealing with human identities. So in iShare, when we say identity providers, it's only about human identities and never machine identities, right? So identity providers are service providers who provide with services for any of the red organizations here, basically, to store their identities. This can be an identity provider who, say, for example, service consumer uses to store or to create accounts for their employees, basically. And these employees can then use this identity provider to identify themselves at any of the service provider, right? So here as well, important to know that this is federated and distributed role. So every service consumer has a right to choose its own identity provider, and this identity provider will work with any service provider. So service provider do not need to create and maintain accounts for service consumers, and they can simply rely on this identity provider to provide with the right identity with the right level of assurance, right? Of course, the identity provider also should be registered within the network as an identity provider in that role, right? And this role is also federated and also portable. So service consumer may use today identity provider A, but tomorrow it can switch to identity provider X, for example. The flows with the service provider will remain the same. It's just a change of URL and nothing else changes from that perspective. The only thing that service consumer has to take care is migrating all the identities from identity provider A to identity provider X. So all portability is provided. Authorization registry, it's another role where it can be a third party service which provides the facility for entitled party to store authorizations. Basically, these are the access rights that it gives to service consumers so that it can go to service provider directly and get access to certain data, right? This I will explain a bit more in detail with an example in following slides. But for now, entitled party uses authorization registries to store authorizations for service consumers at service providers, right? Again, similar to identity providers and satellites, this is a federated and portable role. So authorization registry can be played by any organization, and entire party can choose any authorization registry it wants to use. Also, it's portable. So today it can use authorization registry A and it can switch to authorization registry B tomorrow. All it needs to do is migrate the policies that it has stored at authorization registry and update the URL at the satellite, right? So yeah, this is more about each role that I mentioned. I will skip through them because I already explained these slides. Of course, these slides will be made available to you, so you can also go through them. And of course, the recording of this session will also be made available. One other factor about authorization registry I wanted to highlight here was authorization registry is as a role that is defined in iShare. It only defines the endpoint specifications for authorization registry. However, iShare does not define how to implement an authorization registry. Right? So on the right bottom, you can see this diagram which explains various options that how you can define an authorization registry. So here you can see at the very bottom right, the iShare APIs. These are the only things that iShare specifies. However, the source of the authorizations can come from multiple sources or single source. So for example, it can be just based on policy database. So very simple authorization registry can be simply having a policy database at the backend, and on the front you have the iShare APIs sitting, right? So that when other party connects to you via APIs, it simply looks for the relevant policy in the policy database and generates a response which is sent back. However, an authorization registry can also be developed based on transactional information, for example, or reuse existing information that you have in your LDAP or AD directories, for example, or any other such sources where you are already storing authorizations for various parties, right? So here is an example where you can see that you can either base your authorizations on any of these elements or combination of these. So you can also use your backend systems like ERP, CRM, TMS, or other kind of backend systems that you have in your organizations. And by virtue of the information in the transaction system, for example, let's take an example of an order management system. So you receive an order from your customer, and in that order management system, you also usually keep track of which transport organization is going to handle the transport and logistics of that particular delivery of the order. So you also update that in your backend system. If you look at it, this itself is in a way giving authorization for the transport company to get access to that information which is needed for the transport company based on that order, right? So you can use that information and generate on the fly a policy or a response at your in front of your AR basically, and that is why you see this blue block in between, that is about authorization determining logic, which uses various sources of information if necessary to generate the right response when invoked via an API. Yes. Then identity provider, as I said, is basically used for human identities. In iShare, we are very closely relying on EIDAS framework for the use of identity providers. However, the technical specifications are what we have defined to make sure that we remain interoperable and not have multiple different um, options, because then you are no longer interoperable. So we use OpenID Connect as the base standard for it. So what does iShare enable or support? So in terms of functionality is it various kind of interactions. So all machine to machine interactions. So you can have fully automated machines talking to each other, sharing data with each other, and all working through when you are simply providing your authorizations in right authorization registry. The machines can automatically share data with each other, for example, or human to machine. So when, of course, you need to share data with humans via portals or via applications, mobile applications, and those mechanisms are also supported or specified how to enable them. Right. What is facilitated is flexible authorizations. So the authorizations request response model is such that it allows you to have very broad authorization or very fine grain authorization. Key thing that what it is mainly about is it enables attribute based access to all the organizations. So you can actually control which data points you want to share with which participant and what rights on that data points can that party has. And also with the data license, you specify what that party can do with that data. And as I said, flexibility and portability in terms of storing where your authorizations are. So it can be in multiple sources, it can be in different authorization registry providers, and you can switch from one provider to another, right? Similarly, for identities, it's also portable identities, which I already explained. So identity providers can be used and can be switched at any instance. Sorry, that an organization teams the right identity provider that it wants to use. What it also enables is delegation of rights. So not only data owner being able to give rights to data consumer, but it can also control if that if I as a party A give rights to party B, then party B can also give rights to party C, and then party C can directly go to the data and fetch the data. So that's the delegation of the authorizations that is also possible. And all of this is enabled while still keeping the owner in the control of the data. So whenever the owner gives rights, it also specifies all the conditions and the level that it wants to control, how many further down the line the delegations can happen and things like that. Yeah. So that was an introduction to iShare. Now let's look at how what is the data space, and then we'll look at how iShare is fitting in this data space model. Right. So a data space is by definition a decentralized ecosystem built by parties coming together with a common purpose. Right. So it's essentially a logical thing and not something physical, or it's not a platform. Let's say like that. It's essentially when organizations come together and they want to exchange data, then you form a data space which allows you to define how the data will be shared amongst the participants, right? So you can see on the right diagram that demonstrates the logical boundary of the data space. And on the top, you can see data consumers and data providers essentially. So these are the parties who are actually going to share data with each other. And on the bottom, you see these provisioning roles like identity and authorization service providers and marketplace and other service providers. So there are more kind of services, but these are what we see as the minimum services that are needed in any data spaces. But there are additional kind of services which are possible and may be necessary in some data spaces, depending on what the capabilities of data consumers and providers are. And in between, you see a key element that is the trust and the data space governance block. So when you organize such a multi-party space, basically, you need a governance mechanism in order to make sure that whatever has been agreed between the participants can be followed through, and new participants who want to join the same data space are also abiding by that. And as over time, new opportunities arrive or new technological developments happen, you may want to evolve your mechanisms to make it much more efficient for sharing of data, for example. Right. So in Hyper Trust, what we do is we bring the necessary components from iShare and Fiverr along with the basic governance structure, and we give you a sort of ready-made template to create a data space based on Hyper Trust building blocks. Right. Data spaces, uh, as I said, are built by organizations coming together for common purpose, and they are built around real businesses essentially. To give you some example, which are agreeing on data interoperability, data sovereignty, data value creation, governance, data services, and those kind of elements, right? It can be within sectors, within verticals, or wherever there is a value that can be derived based on using of creation of data space. Essentially enabling exchange of data that you do today in an inefficient manner to make it more efficient, and more importantly, exchange of hidden data that you are not sharing today, but by sharing that you can actually monetize on that data and further come up with save time, money, or irritation. So those elements which enables you to perform your businesses better with more efficient manner, right? So introducing to you this data spaces building blocks, which we use as a ready template for any data space that wants to create uh, any group of organizations which want to create data spaces. They can use this building blocks to form their data space. Important for you because under this call you are a consortium, and the idea is that you are creating these data spaces and be at the forefront of creation of these data spaces which are used within your own businesses and sectors, basically. I will introduce on each data space building blocks and the verticals specifically. So broadly speaking, these are four verticals of these building blocks. The first vertical is about data interoperability. So data interoperability talks about mainly about what data to exchange, how, essentially, and how to interpret that data. It also includes elements of provenance and traceability, right? So you see three sub building blocks within that vertical is data models and formats. So it allows you to understand by means of schematics how the data is formatted, how to read that information, and how to understand that information. Data exchange API. so you know exactly how to share data with each other. So it cannot be that you are sending data via one channel, but the other party is expecting it via another channel, right? So you need to sync on the channel on how we will share that information. And provenance and traceability is more mainly about the origins of the data and how you uh, uh, how you trace it back to the place where this data originated from, right? The second vertical is about data sovereignty and trust. So again, in any kind of data exchange, you need to have the trust element as the basis. And how do you do that is basically by use of identity management or identification, authentication, authorization, basically. So these blocks are dealing about that. So identity management is about how do you where do you store identities or how identities are procured, the human identities, machine identities, how they are enabled in the system, the portability aspects, and those elements. The trusted exchange is how do you trust the identities issued by authorities, and how do you trust each other in order to share data. And that's where the trusted exchange element talks about. And access and usage control is more about authorization and what you can do with that data, right? Then the third vertical is about data value creation. So of course, we talked about hidden data that you would like to share and generate monetary benefits out of it, either directly or indirectly, because you may not always uh, put your data on sale for real money, but you can also use that data as a leverage to improve on the business processes, make it more efficient, and that itself gives you a lot of advantage in terms of more business and better business opportunities. So this vertical mainly talks about creation of value, and um, for that there are elements which are necessary, that is metadata and discovery services, because on one hand, you have defined the data models and those elements, but how do you interpret that data if you are speaking in different languages? Then you need metadata and discovery services in order to enable and support multiple data models and format. Publication and marketplace services. So one is, of course, due to nature of your business, you are already in interaction with organizations you want to share data with, and then you can already have a conversation in terms of how and where to share the data. But on the other hand, what is enabled is with marketplace is you need some kind of data set, but you don't know who are the providers and how will they provide you with that information. And for that, you need the publication and marketplace services essentially to search for the data providers, or other way around. If you are a provider, search for the consumer who would be interested in your data. Third sub block is about data usage accounting. Of course, when you are sharing this information or data exchange, and your motive is to benefit out of it, specifically when you are selling that information, then you also need to do usage accounting, because then you can bill appropriately to the consumers. And the fourth vertical is about data space governance. As I mentioned earlier, in any data space, governance is also one of the key elements that needs to be catered to, because this is where you will enter into business and operational agreements as well as organizational agreements. So these agreements are agreements that these organizations who came together to create this data space will enter into, and these agreements is what enables you to trust a bit also on other organizations, that they will also follow by the same agreements that are mentioned in here, because they agreed that they will abide by these agreements. right? So in terms of how iShare enables this is basically it covers the blocks that are highlighted with iShare logo. So it's mainly about data sovereignty and trust because, as I already mentioned, iShare's scope is about identification, authentication, and authorization. So it all enables identity management, trusted exchange, access, and usage control policies. At a very basic level, it does cover metadata and discovery services because when you register yourself as a participant in satellite, you also provide certain URLs which points to the services that you offer and things like that, or as well as also where you keep your authorizations, for example. And data space and governance, of course, as I mentioned, the framework itself is including a very uh, ready to use base business and operational agreements, which all of the data spaces can use. Of course, it can be augmented by adding additional business and operational requirements that you may have for your specific data space. However, the very basic ones that are needed are already covered and provided within the framework, right? Organizational agreements are always between the organizations of a data space, so it is very data space specific. So let's take a deeper dive into data sovereignty and trust building block. How does iShare enable that? So identity and access control policies. So these are the principles that iShare enables at any data space, and you can see on the right image that this is a data space, and these are the services that are defined in iShare. These are the specifications provided by iShare. Um, the identity provider enables the identities of humans basically. So any organization can use any identity provider to identify themselves at any service or portal basically, and it is based on the standards, open standards like OpenID Connect or 2.0, and the authorization model is basically derived or inspired by XSEML standard. However, it's just a request response model, right? And storage of the policy can be in any language. The trust authority or trust anchor, that is the iShare satellite, which enables you to find each other and trust each other because that is where you can find that this party has also signed the same agreement that you have signed. So the concept of the multilateral agreement, as I mentioned previously, that proof is provided by iShare satellite, right? Um, so and this is all enabled via federation. So a brief diagram about how the federation looks like of satellites. So there is a satellite that is always run by a foundation as a backup, and every data space has its own satellite, and these are all synchronized registers basically, so that no matter where you register yourself as a participant, you are also visible at other data spaces, and any participant from that data space can interact with you, right? So this is how the satellite structure looks like. It is based on distributed ledger technology, and it is based on also the framework specifications, right? So iShare Foundation is the only one which can register data spaces and create the satellites or uh, register satellites, and in turn satellites can register any kind of participants in the iShare role model. And this is another illustration of how trust is enabled between different data spaces. So parties who are already part of any of the data space can reuse their existing registration information to interact with other data space participants, for example, right? Um, so again, this role model and this role model now in the perspective of data space, as you can see, um, as I explained the role model of the uh, data space, there you can see that on the top you had the data provider and data consumer, or the parties who were interested in the exchange of data, and in between you had, or at the bottom you had identity and authorization trust providers. So they are already defined in iShare. Also the satellite, which is sort of acting as trust anchor, but as well as a bit of governance aspect, because this enables or this stores which agreements a particular participant has entered into, and based on that you can trust whether this organization with whom you are interacting with can be trusted, and it has also signed the same agreements or not, right? um, with iShare, then enabling various data spaces like logistics in different countries, building sector or construction and energy, various data spaces that are being enabled with iShare today. And what it enables, as you can see, this is an example of what can be enabled in one of the value chains, a very relevant value chain that we deal with knowingly or directly or indirectly, basically every day, is all the products that we buy essentially are manufactured in some place, and most likely it is not in the country where you are residing, but somewhere else, and that needs to be transported to a retail shop where you can go and buy them. But you can see that that journey is such a complex journey, and so many parties involved from different regions, and different sectors as well. So financial sector, the transport sector, transport itself has multi-models, so different models that are being used. The authorities like customs, which when custom duties needs to be placed. Again, yeah, as you can see, these are from different regions. So financial sectors in different regions, also transporters in different regions. They can all be seamlessly working with each other and trust each other, yeah, irrespective of where they are operating, by use of this common framework that iShare provides. And with that, they can share data in a trusted manner. So enabling a much more efficient cross-domain value chain is possible, right? Validation of participants, basically what further details, to give you a bit of more detail in terms of what is provided in via the satellite, so that you can trust other participants, is basically every participant's detail about their signed contracts. So all the contracts that they have signed, a hash value is stored in the blockchain, and you can validate that hash value whenever you want. But essentially it also gives you information, okay, which agreement was signed basically by that organization, and it includes the iShare specific agreements, but also data space specific agreements. So each data space can have their own additional license, additional agreements that they would like their participants to sign. That's not mandatory, of course, but it is an option that is provided, right? And all of this is validated by the registering satellite. So satellite is in that sense acting as trust anchor, because it validates these information before entering into the system, right? They validate the participant details as in their existence by checking of their Chamber of Commerce extract documentation and various other such documentations. There are identifiers like an EORI number, and they determine the level of assurance using a predefined framework which is based on EIDAS framework. So every organization can be classified into certain level of assurances, basically based on the level of processes they follow within their organization. And these processes are linked to ISO standards or CMM levels or Six Sigma or various those certifications, basically, and audit requirements. Some of these audit requirements are mandated within a sector by authorities or regulators, basically. So all those things are considered in that sense. Of course, data spaces for specific sectors or specific purposes can add additional assessment items in the level of assurance, and only when they meet certain level they are defined at whatever level they meet. A level of assurance is determined while registering that participant in the network. Um, the participants are also validated via the means because they need to buy eIDAS certificate when they want to register in the network. So buying an eIDAS certificate qualified seals essentially. The process is that a physical validation is done by the certifying authority of that organization, and also validated which person from that organization is allowed to represent that organization. So that gives you the legal aspect or legal coverage, basically. And this is the very certificate that is used to sign all the information that you are sharing with other participants. So the other participant can trust what you are sending. It's essentially equivalent to an organization sending a letter which is signed by the authorized signatory of that organization to another organization, and that forms the basis of trust in the traditional world, which is paper based. But with the paper based signature, now changing that into a digital signature which has valid backing in court of law as well. And of course, the role within the network is also determined, as in which of the role from the role model is played by this participant, and only then entered in the satellite. So the elements that are enabled for data value creation or the basic metadata and discovery in iShare is about when parties are registered. The satellite provides you with an endpoint where you can query on whether a particular party is registered in any of the data spaces or not, right? And uh, and there is for understanding a data space requirement, there is an URL provided in the data space registry. So iShare Satellite also gives you an endpoint where you can query on specific data spaces and also get the definition of that data space. So digitally readable definition where where you can identify what standards are being used at that data space, which are based on the 12 building blocks that we saw previously, right? As an a pointer for data provider. So data provider has when they are registered in the satellite, they provide their capabilities endpoint, um, which gives you a list of all the services that this data provider exposes, basically, along with a brief description of each of those items, and also information about how to access that service, whether it's a protected service or not, and when it is protected, where to get the token from, for example, right? The data owner also registers its own details, or any participant basically registers also all its details like contact details, its general description about the organization, the website and general contact information, um, the location information if they need to, And there is also an option to register various tags, so you can specify any kind of data there. And as well as it can specify the authorization registries where they are storing their authorizations, right? So data pointers to uh, where I, as a data owner, I am storing my authorizations. And this can be multiple authorization registries, for example. So if I am a member in 5 different data spaces, I can choose 5 different authorization registries, for example, each one for each data space. And all of that information can be found via the satellite information, basically. I, as a data owner, also provide you a link with my data provider. So where I am hosting my data and which services are hosted at which provider, basically. That is what I can do as a data owner. Okay, sorry. Data space governance. Um, as I said, we cover also data space governance. Let's take a closer look at what elements are covered in the governance aspect. So iShare provides with the basic legal and governance framework, which forms the basis of governance building blocks, right? So the 3 building blocks about business agreements, operational agreements, and organizational agreements. Um, uh, but that is important also for businesses to achieve the data sovereignty in one hand, because the data licenses that you use, they are also part of the framework, or they are defined already in the framework, and all participants can use any of these licenses. More licenses can be added when there is a need, by simply raising a change request, right? However, these agreements enforce legal data usage policies when used. So when data owner provides with authorization to data consumer, it has possibility to attach a data license. Sorry, data license along with that authorization to the data consumer. So when the data consumer receives that in data, it knows under which license it has been provided that data. And because of the iShare agreement that they have signed, the consumer is obliged to abide by the data license rules. When found by data owner that the data consumer has not obliged to or haven't stick to the data license policy, then it can use this evidence in the court of law to prove that it was shared under this license, and the data consumer has acted in violence of that, so that legal action could be taken against the consumer, basically. So that is the legal protection that is already provided with the iShare framework. There is, of course, a basic level of business agreements that is provided, as in terms of uh, with basically this enabled by these mechanisms, essentially where you can give usage policies to the data consumers, and data consumers basically have a right to know how to use that database under this requirement. The operational agreements basically cover the availability aspects of certain services, for example, authorization registry or identity provider or satellite, for example, that they have to be up all the time, because you cannot, for example, carry out your business if the services are not available. So they need to remain operational. So the SLAs are defined for these organizations when they participate in any data space within that role, right? So it applies for those organizations. Organizational agreements, as I mentioned earlier, is always between the participants of the data space. So any data space can have their own additional specific agreements that they would like all the participants of the data space to follow. Of course, this is not always mandatory, so you can or you may or you may not have that, but there is an option for that. So, how do you arrange for governance of such a data space, right? So, iShare also provides you with a ready template that you can use today, which is based on iShare's own governance framework, basically. So, in a data space, as you can see on the left side, it's the operational elements. For example, every data space should have one satellite at minimum, because that's where you will register all the participants by going through various checks of that on that participant for that data space. And additionally, that data space can be responsible for promoting this data space and adoption of this data space, for example, and also maintaining the standards that you use within the data space. So essentially, the data space definition that you have created, which is of course based on these 12 blocks so that are demonstrated here. And on the other hand, you have your councils of participants and sponsors, if you may like, who are basically advising or giving inputs to the satellite to update various aspects in the data space management, and also a change advisory board. So, to give you a bit of understanding what these boards or councils are, basically, council of participant is basically where each participant within the data space has one seat, right? And they have, so whenever there is a new update or whatever changes you would require within the data space definition, you would discuss that within the council of participants and change advisory boards, basically, and they give you their advice in terms of uh, whether how they see the impact of that change within their own organizations, for example, but also in general, right? Also from their experience. So, council of participants is mainly at more strategic level, how not going in the technical depths, basically, but how the data space should grow and further, what is the strategic direction of that data space. But for technical aspects about the data space, there is a change advisory board, and you can see that is mentioned LOFT. So L stands for legal, O stands for operational, F for functional, T for technical. Sorry. So in change advisory board, again, these are people experts in these areas, also coming from participants, basically, who are part of this data space. And any change that you would like to bring in the data space definition are discussed amongst with the change advisory board, specifically bringing the experts which for these topics when a change in that topic is necessary, right? And they can provide with you with the advice and guidance in terms of how what changes has what impact and whether they make sense for your data space or not. This the council of participants essentially also appoint supervisory board, and the supervisory board basically supervise the operations of the satellites, basically, so that there is an oversight in terms of how the satellites operate. Of course, these elements are how this is closely derived from how iShare is governed today. So iShare, instead of satellite, it's the foundation here, with the executive board here, basically, of the foundation, and we are responsible for iShare's adoption, the maintenance of trust framework, and other activities. And we also have council of participants, change advisory board, council of and a supervisory board which supervises what actions we do. So this is basically quite related to how iShare is being governed today. But this as a template can be used also by data spaces to as a governance model for their own data space. Of course, this is not mandatory, but this is something that iShare provides as a reference, right? So, in that sense, what else the foundation does is we provide you with option to register your data space, right? So on the right, you can see actual screenshot of a data space registration information. And this information, of course, you can also get via call of API via the satellite, and it gives you all these details about the particular data space, right? Just to give you a little bit more insight in terms of, so there is a title of a data space ID, a unique identifier that we have defined for any data spaces, a data space definition URL. So this is the URL which I was talking about, which gives you a pointer to a digital definition of your data space. So in this data space, you define the standards and the models that you use for all the 12 building blocks, basically. So, but it is in a readable form, machine readable form. A data space website, if it is available. So if you, as a data space, host your website or publish your website, you can put your URL here so that other participants can learn more about your data space from there, or joining information and other things. Tags, basically giving you the opportunity to specify various keywords that are relevant for your data space, the status of your data space, the country of registration of the data space, and also the operations, country of operations, where you are operating this data space. Also, which sector or industry this data space is mainly focused at. You can also list down specific agreements that participants of your data space has to sign, basically. So here you can see there is an additional agreement called logistics and terms of use in this example on the screen. I hope this was readable. Um, but yeah, essentially the registration of data spaces is also available and possible, and this is all linked into when a participant is registered. At that time as well, you can select which data space that participant is registered for, right? Um, and so we saw this governance model template, as I said, and here is, as I mentioned, iShare's governance model already. So here you'll see our executive board, the trust governance and the standard management and the marketing activities that we do. We are supervised by a supervisory board, which is appointed by our council of participants and council of sponsors, basically, and they provide us with advice in how strategic directions and other various elements, how the foundation and iShare should grow. Um, Also, when we propose certain things, they provide us with advice in that perspective. And the change advisory board, which is also appointed by the members of iShare, they help us, or we discuss all the changes in the framework with them, and imbibe those changes within the standard. So the future of this governance model looks more or less like this, in the sense that we expect when there are a lot of data spaces, each from each data space, from their council of participants, they will send a representative to the council of participants of iShare Foundation, so that every data space which is based on iShare has a say in terms of their advice capabilities to the executive board in the future direction for iShare. Same applies in the council of sponsors. When they have council of sponsors, they can send a representation at the council of sponsors of iShare council. And similarly, for the change advisory board, the experts from the technical aspects of the standard, they can, each of them has a possibility to represent in the change advisory board of the foundation. and in turn, which will be part of the discussions when we make those regular discussions with our change advisory boards, basically about the changes that needs to be done in iShare framework. So, to give you a bit of perspective, we have regular quarterly Council of Participant meetings and change advisory boards run by the foundation. So all the participants of iShare are free to join them and represent their organizations basically, or data spaces, whichever is the case. Um, and of course, when needed, we also arrange for ad hoc such meetings or such sessions in order to fast track certain changes if that is necessary. Right. But with this, the federated governance model is enabled by iShare, and each data space is more or less independent in their own governance aspects as well as operational aspects. However, they also have a say in terms of how the framework further develops when there is a necessary change that has a broader impact and broader advantage for a lot of data spaces, then those changes can be rolled up into the main iShare standard, basically, or the framework standard. Whereas data space specific changes can be maintained at the data space level. I hope this makes sense to you. This is how we enable the federated data spaces which are governed independently, yet part of the same framework which enables you with the interoperable level of trust. Yes. So as I mentioned, we have regular advisory boards and council of participants sessions maintained by foundation. Similarly, the data spaces, when they choose similar governance model, they can run their own cycles basically of these sessions. Active participation is encouraged from all the participants so that all the changes are discussed with them and they can contribute as much as possible. So that because whatever changes happen may or may not directly impact you as a participant, and uh, so it's essential that you participate and you know what changes are coming through and what impact it may have on you, right? And as I said, one of the principles of iShare is that no one organization can benefit on expense of others. It's essentially every participant, irrespective of their location, size, sector, whatever, they have equal rights at the table with other participants. So there is no discrimination in that sense. You are there, you have the opportunity to be present there, represent yourself, uh, put across your views, and if you are not happy with a certain change being proposed by a certain organization, then justify that, and we can try to see what changes can make through, which is not impactful for all the organizations, and which changes we cannot continue with because it impacts certain organizations in negative way. Right? Of course, we provide you with this knowledge also to make sure that you as a data space can also adopt this as a governance framework. Of course, it is up to you whether you would like this, but this is an example of a working governance model, um, which has been working very fine, and you don't necessarily need to reinvent your wheel with your data space, so you can reuse this model actually. Okay, it's time for a short break, let's say, and then we go through an example of how this iShare role model and the framework fits. So let's take an example to understand it better. But let's have a quick break of 10 minutes. So we'll be back in, it's 10:25 now. So let's be back at 10:35. Okay, I think we are almost all back. I hope. Yeah. Okay. Let's continue. So now let's go at look at the example of how a use case is made feasible with use of iShare framework. There are some examples that are there, and we'll go through one of them. So, for example, there is a climate agreement reporting example where businesses are acting as data owners, and government or the artificial intelligence supplier service providers basically act as consumer and energy suppliers, which has the data of the energy consumption, are acting as data provider. Right? Another example that is enabled, one of the examples that is enabled by iShare is prediction of arrival of goods. Very common one, though it's still a bit of nightmare in a lot of logistics world to exactly trace where your package is. But in this sense, the data owner is the shipper, the receiver of the goods is the consumer, and the port terminals gives you the data that is needed to track where the good is. Um, Another example, food value chain reporting, where a farmer acts as a data owner, and it provides the rights to the data to government or artificial intelligence service providers uh, from crop control platforms, which are actually collecting a lot of IoT-based data from farms in terms of their irrigation process and farming process, and that information is not shared today with a lot of potential organizations which can derive various value out of it, and for governments, for example, in terms of emissions that each farming needs, certain governments may require those kind of information, so farmers have to share that, and with iShare that's all seamlessly possible. Let's take a deeper look at the climate reporting example, how that is enabled in this sense. So this is actual example in real world, which is there is a data space that is created based on iShare as a framework, and the data owner is actually the business owner who owns or who has offices, and it is a party who is procuring the electricity from the electricity supplier, for example, or energy supplier from an energy provider. Um, the data owner needs to share the energy consumption information about their business premises per meter square, how much energy units is their business consuming. Um, and this information needs to be collected by one of the government agencies in order to determine the current situation more closely, as in which buildings are more energy efficient versus which are not. So in the first step, what happens is, sorry, here in this step, that the government agency needs the consumption of the organization who grows plants in this case, and has received a grant, and is one of the clauses within the grant was that it should share the energy consumption data because it has certain limitations in terms of energy usage under the grant. So how does the agency procure the data from the data owner, or in that sense, the business owner? So government can actually check on the satellite details about this data owner, where this data owner is keeping its information. So with the capabilities endpoint from the data owner, the information can be found by the agency. Uh, then it knows that the energy consumption data is stored at EDSN. That's an energy grid provider, basically, who stores that energy consumption data for the data owner, so that the agency now knows the data can be procured from this data provider. So it actually requests the data from this provider. Now, the provider needs to know whether there is the agency is authorized to get access to that data, because as per their records, it's not the data owner. So somebody must have given them rights. When coming via iShare, they can specify that they are using iShare mechanism, and they can specify that they have authorization for getting that data. Then EDSN needs to check that information somewhere. So EDSN first then goes to because EDSN knows the data is about the data owner. That's the business plant grower business. It needs to check where it stores its authorizations. If it already doesn't know, so it goes to satellite. In this case, it doesn't know, so it goes to satellite and checks the details of this plant grower to see where it stores its authorization information. It gets the details of the authorization registry where the state owner stores the authorizations, and it then sends the request to that authorization registry to check if this data owner has given rights to this government agency to have access to the energy consumption information. Um, when when the data owner has already not given the rights to the agency, there are two options. One, either it will simply send a rejection. So the EDSN then knows, okay, no such rights are given to this agency, so it will not share the data with the agency, and instead send back an error saying you are not authorized for that information. What can happen as well is that the authorization registry can send a notification to the data owner. Of course, this is up to authorization registry how it has implemented this feature, that these agency is requesting for this data set information. Do you want to grant access? So this is more like a trigger to create a authorization. That is also possible, by the way. So authorization, in this case, the authorization registry sends this notification to the data owner saying, hey, this agency wants to get the details of your energy consumption information for this period. Do you agree to that, and would you like to grant them access? So the data owner says, yes, I am okay with that. And um, uh, when data owner accepts that, and policy is registered in the authorization registry, and then authorization registry can say to EDSN, yes, that party is authorized, and then EDSN can share the data with the authority, basically, which is requesting this data. So this is one of the examples of how data sharing happens, and this is all machine to machine. As you can see, there is no identity provider involved yet in this whole scenario, right? So how do you begin? So more, by the way, more detailed steps, because these are very high level steps yet. The more detailed steps will be covered in iSHARE deep dive, which happens on Wednesday. So also make sure that you join the Wednesday training session where I'm going to cover in detail the iShare, how do you implement iShare technical specifications, right? So what do you need to start your data spaces successfully? So ideally, you start with an existing confidential business data of many organizations which are and with the launching data consumer. So for you, for most of you with IFA Trust, Yeah, your use case itself, for which you have made the proposal, that itself is a good starting point. But it should be something with which you can actually go to the market, essentially, right? Start simple. Make a very simple service first, enable using this framework, or using all the building blocks from the data spaces, so that you can test and validate what things are working fine for you, and how to start with more complex scenarios. So if you start simple, you already have good exposure and understanding of all the services that you want to expose within a data space. And with a clear definition, you understand what works with all other organizations, because it's a typical scenario where you are dealing with a lot of organizations within your data space, and it's always a challenge when you're dealing with a lot of parties to bring them all aligned to the same um, understanding. And starting with a simple service would help in getting there faster. So, and once that process is known to all of the parties involved, it becomes a bit more easier for them to grasp for more complex services. Build on iShare Trust framework from start, so you don't need to wait till you figure out, okay, now you need an element to enable trusted exchange of data, and you simply can exchange data using some APIs without any security. That's an afterthought. It's a typical scenario today that a lot of security aspects are considered afterthought, but you know that that itself is a big pain when discovered later, that it actually derails your whole planning. So instead, start from the beginning with the trust framework, so that you are already covered with all the basic security and legal aspects, which helps you to kickstart with your services. When you are ready, you simply are ready to go live as well, right? And of course, don't reinvent the wheel. As we have tried to use as much as existing standards and open source components, we also provide you with the same things, so you can rely on these proven standards and components that are available to you, which you can start using. Yeah. On iShare specifically, if you want to start becoming a participant of iShare, it's a three-step process, a simple one, two, three. In essence, what you do when you want to become an iShare participant is step one: identify the role and or data space you wish to join. So, as per the role model I just explained, you need to identify which role you would be playing. Of course, you can play as an organization multiple roles, but you would start somewhere with one role, ideally, and then you start with that role first. Uh, so either you are a data service provider, service consumer, um, entitled party, authorization registry, identity provider, or even a satellite when you are going to set up your own data space. You need a satellite organization as well, right? So step one is all about identifying your role. By the way, this is also on iShare's website. So you can click on these steps to learn more exactly on how to identify your role in the data space you wish to join. Step two is development activities that you need to do regarding your role, and testing and conforming to those specifications. So iShare essentially is a standard or a document that is provided, and a set of specifications. We don't, we are not a platform, or we don't provide you with components. We don't run any components for you, for example. However, there are open source reference examples of these roles that are available. So authorization registry, service providers, these kind of elements. Also, identity provider, both via iShare GitHub as well as iForTrust GitHub, you can find them. and you can use them as your technical components. But remember, technical implementation is one aspect within your role. You have more than technical elements required in order to fulfill that role, specifically for all the certified roles like authorization, registry, identity providers, or satellite. You also need to specify all the operational aspects of your organization, and go through an assessment framework together with either the foundation or with your satellite, basically, to get onboarded. So also familiarize yourself with that. But of course, before you do that, or while you are doing that in parallel, what you necessarily need to do is implement your technical specifications or technical components, and get ready with your with at least the technical part of your role, right? And that includes with the conformance testing. So once you have implemented on your or you did your own development, conformance testing is conducted along with your satellite, which validates your technical compliance, basically, of your implementation, so that you are interoperable with other participants. Third step is where you will focus on the formalities, specifically regarding non-technical aspects. So procuring of EIDAS certificates, completing formalities, providing with various documents like Chamber of Commerce extract, going through the assessment if you are one of the certified parties to determine the level of assurance of your organization, and things similar to that. And signing, of course, the important aspect, the signing of the agreements that will enable you to participate in this network, right? Um, the advantage of joining this network is, of course, you join once and you reap the benefits constantly, and more participants can connect to you, identify and authorize you in a standardized way, and you move away from doing bilateral contracts to all digital dynamic agreements between each other in terms of how and what to share, and what how that data is utilized as well, right? So it's a three-step process with iShare. Okay, it's you can of course get in touch with us, and here are some of our details, also some of the links that are provided to you for the learning. But this was more about what is iShare today. Oops. So now time for question and answers, I would say. Please raise your questions. Better. Let me see if there are questions already. Yeah, there are a couple of questions already. Which parts are managed by iShare and which ones are needed to be managed by developers? Uh, so as I said, iShare is essentially a standard in that sense. So it is mainly a document which is acting as a guideline for you. To give you a bit of analogy in that perspective, is that consider that you are an hardware manufacturer, and in your hardware you want to include a USB port. So you will develop that USB port yourself, but you need to make sure that it is recognized as, I mean, all the USB devices out there can work with you. So what you do is you go to the USB association, which maintains a standard for it, learn from them what you need to do in order to make sure that it is compliant USB port that you are enabling in your hardware, so that all other USB devices will work with you. So it is similar to that. So iShare is a foundation which maintains this iShare framework or standard, and you simply comply with this standard and use this standard for all the data exchange that you want to do with others. So developers maintain all the technical components themselves. We don't maintain anything for them. You are part of this network, and you contribute to how this standard is specified. I hope that answers your question. Okay. Then the next question: which type of blockchain network is used for trust validation process? Where can we find details about this mechanism? So I'm not sure what this question means, but I am assuming that we are asking the blockchain network that we use for iSHARE satellite. Then it's Hyperledger Fabric. However, um, it's not used for trust validation process. It's used mainly as a iSHARE satellite, as I said, is mainly a registry of participants. So from that perspective, the satellites are the entry point for participants to register themselves in the network, and once registered, they are available to all satellites, available via all satellites to all participants of different data spaces as well. The details about our the details as I shared, also there are links that that have the iShare specifications and the framework itself. They are all present, and also via our website you can find all the details explaining these elements, right? um, I hope that answers your question. Okay, then the next question: are the resources processing storage of each satellite centralized, managed by non-profit organization, or distributed? So as I said, satellite is essentially based on Hyperledger Fabric. So each satellite is acting as a node on that ledger. So it's a totally decentralized, distributed function and federated function. So satellite is a trust anchor within a data space. So it's an organization within your data space acting as a satellite and complying with the requirements of being a satellite, right? So and that satellite is a trusted organization. Ideally, satellite is played by a not-for-profit organization in your data space, because that helps you in maintaining the trust level within your data space, also on the satellite, right? Um, uh, but iShare does not mandate it to be a not-for-profit, for example. There may be cases where you want to create a very closed data space, and in that case you may want to run a satellite which doesn't matter whether it's a for-profit or not. But ideally, in open data spaces where you encourage more and more organizations to join, it's a it's ideally a not-profit organization acting as satellite. More recent relevant example of this could be considered as TradeLens. I don't know how many of you have followed that story, but TradeLens is one of the key blockchain projects from IBM and Maersk that was stopped by Maersk. And one of the reasons that most of the organizations are claiming is that they cannot trust in that, because it was primarily owned and run by Maersk and IBM. So other competitors were not that keen in joining that network and sharing very sensitive information which they were not sharing previously. So if you run a satellite which is for profit within your domain, you run the risk of going through that similar path. So ideally, it's recommended that your satellite is not for profit and neutral entity, ideally. I hope that answers this question. Then I can go to next question. Can organizations, persons without COC, EORI register in the satellite? So satellites do not register any persons. So persons are never registered in satellite. Satellite is only registry of organizations. Persons are always represented via an identity provider from an organization. Remember, this framework is not for personal data sharing, as in not relevant for social media or general internet usage. That is not our target. Our target is organization to organization data sharing, and we always assume that data sharing always happens between agreements between two organizations. So it's always a legal entity sharing a data with another legal entity, and a person when acting when involved in data sharing is always representing a particular organization in that sense. So it is always linked to a legal entity that it is representing. Registering an organization in satellite without an identifier or chamber of commerce extract is so to give you a chamber of commerce extract is one that is usually needed, because that is how you prove that you are the legal authority in that organization, um, who can represent that organization in legal terms, and can because you are signing a legal agreement when you are joining the network. So you need to validate, the satellite needs to validate that legal representative from that organization is actually signing, and that's why you need the chamber of commerce extract. EORI number, currently iShare uses EORI as its identifier for all organizations, and getting an EORI number for parties outside Europe is also very simple, but for parties within the Europe, it's usually derivable from your existing legal identifiers. This differs from country to country. There is a list of there is a PDF document which specifies for which country which identifier can be used for determining their EORI number. You don't need to get it from customs necessarily before using it, because the way EORI operates is when you deal with customs, they automatically register you if it is not registered, specifically for European-based organizations. However, also for organizations which are outside of EU, they can simply come to any of the European country to get registered and get their EORI number from any of the authorities. Having said that, we currently also have an RFC within iShare to support more identifiers than just EORI number as the legal entity identifier. Though of course, because we maintain the neutral aspect and open aspect in our standard, and that is one of the guiding principles. We would like to also maintain that with the identity of an organization. So and we are trying to find the best possible solution in terms of allowing multiple registrations of different identifiers that are possible to be used. However, it's not simple, because if you allow different identifiers, then interoperability is lost, because you don't know how to search for another organization when you don't know their right identifier. So that currently is under discussion on what is the best solution in order to support multiple identifiers, and we are working towards it. So in future, we will definitely add more options than just EORI. But as it stands today, if you have to onboard on iShare today, you need an EORI number. One thing to note is you need only this when you are registering in the production. Basically, these information in test, you can just start upfront with the dummy values for EORI. You don't need Chamber of Commerce in the test environment, of course. So once you have your working prototype or working MVP proven, at that moment you can decide to go to production, and then you go into these formalities basically. I hope that answers your question. I hope. Then the next question: do every data space need an EU, EOD, or for iShare? So I think I just answered that question. Um, Data space doesn't need an EOD, but satellites or participants do. So data space identifier is something that we made when we are registering data space. Note that there is currently no organization who is registering or maintaining a list of data spaces. It's only us, we are doing that, because there are no organizations out there in the world, anyone doing that. I hope that answers your question, Tarmo. Then I will go to the next question. How does the data owner tell the satellite which resources are available? Is there a DCAT compatible interface for exchange of metadata about resources? Yeah, so satellite only stores the pointer basically to a URL. So data owner, when registering with the satellite, it needs to provide a capabilities URL basically, and under that capabilities URL, which is a JSON file, you specify all the resources. It can point to DCAT compatible metadata resource pointer and additional services, or it can simply point to one single URL for that perspective, right? And so the capabilities endpoint is in that sense very open. It allows any kind of uh, services that you want to list, that you want to expose to all the other iShare participants. I hope that answers your question. Then I have another question: how is iShare related to IDS? So, well, IDS is mainly about and reference architecture for creating component basically, which can enable talking to another component which is compliant, and it has inbuilt control on technical usage capabilities. However, that's purely thought of from component level perspective, whereas iShare brings in the perspective of organizations and the legal aspects, which IDS RAM did not had. So now they have started to add those elements. As you can see, probably if you are following IDS reference architecture, the Paris model is basically participant information, which was non-existent before, but it is actually inspired from iShare satellite. In iShare, satellite was earlier called scheme owner because it was only one organization doing that, but that was federated into satellites, which was always in the roadmap of iShare, because it was waiting for the right moment to introduce the federation. Um, and the legal aspects, which you also see in the IDS rulebook, they are also result of our conversations with IDS in terms of our collaborations, that they take what we have already developed and include that in the reference architectures. I hope that answers your question, Christian. Then, will the slides we have seen today be available to revisit? Yes, they are already actually on the I4Trust GitHub. Let me share this link with you. So the slides are already available from previous session. We'll also update the updated versions soon, but they are more or less the same with some changes, if at all. Then yeah, you can still find those slides there. Then another question: is there an overview of all endpoints on iShare satellite component? Yes, that's also in the dev portal. Um, in the dev portal, you can refer under the common elements and the scheme owner endpoints. They are essentially the endpoints from satellite. And does 5Air's true connector contain iFortrust and iShare tech? True connector, I'm not sure, but Fiverr has implemented iShare specifications in Keyrock and Kong. Basically, these are the two components that have included iShare elements in it. And they are available as open source, of course, also via our GitHub on iForTrust, basically. So you can look at all the components made available under iForTrust here by Fiverr, which are compliant with iShare. Also with examples. So the reference examples are also there in this repository under tutorials, basically, and more. They will be explained, and we go through the deep dive on the Wednesday session. Uh, so there you will learn more on the technical aspects of iShare as well as how Fiverr components have implemented them and how the flows look like with an example. Another question: how you split Keyrock with HLFCA for authentication? Um, I'm not sure I got that question. So Keyrock is a role is a technical component in iShare from identity provider, as well as it implements an authorization registry, and the authentication for identity provider follows OpenID Connect path, basically. And for machine to machine, it is between two organizations, anyways, and that's why you need Kong instead of Keyrock, essentially. Well, um, when you implement as a service provider, you implement Kong and Keyrock both, because the token handling and the token aspects are still implemented in Keyrock, but you don't use them. You use Keyrock in that sense as identity provider or authorization registry, for example. And Kong does basically your gateway, which sits in front of your context broker to protect the data coming out of context broker. But this is exactly what we will discuss in the Wednesday session. Yeah. Yes. Any more questions? Okay. I'll still give you 1 or 2 minutes for any other questions that may come up. Yeah. Well, I think I don't see any more questions popping up, but of course, you know where to reach us. You can also reach directly to me if you have specific questions, and we can have a conversation about it. Of course, and also don't forget to join the other sessions also later today or Fiverr, and tomorrow as well as on Wednesday, which is the last day for training. It's important also for people who want to understand iShare that there is a deep dive session in there, where I explain in all the technical aspects in detail. So today it was more focused on the general aspects of iShare, not going in the depth of the technical aspects that we have. And on Wednesday we look into the technical details further. So when your concepts of these things are clear a bit, then it's much more easier to follow the technical concepts on Wednesday. Then I hope to see you there. And thank you very much for attending this session.